All right, I think we're ready. I'm going to introduce you, and if you could put the speaker slide up, we'll go. So today we are really excited. We have someone who may be familiar to you either in vision or voice. To me, it was voice, but that doesn't matter. We're going to be talking about something that happened a long time ago. Can you imagine the size of the piggy bank that is sitting on the Department of Transportation's shelf somewhere? I was thinking about that this week, and I think it's huge. Many of you may recognize Nathaniel Miner, and I hope that you will welcome him. And we are very excited to hear about the train that never came to Boulder.
Wow. I'm used to speaking into a microphone in a small room that's dark and has a bunch of soft things on the wall. So this is new to me, and just bear with me here. I'm going to take a picture because I usually can't see my audience. Look at that. Thank you all. Today, can we put that first slide? I'm going to tell you in just a few minutes, 20 minutes or so, the story of why, as I understand it, the story of why Boulder County still has not received this train, this mythical train to Denver and Longmont that, as we all know, has been paying, taxpayers here have been paying for it since 2005. Still no train. Why not? When I started covering RTD and transportation for CPR in about 2018, I had been paying attention to this just a little bit. Like I've lived in Colorado since 2014, but this thing came up all the time. Even when I wasn't looking for it, people would ask me about this. And I thought, as I started kind of getting into this issue more, like someone should tell this story like from start to finish. And I guess that person turned out to be me. So let's start it. We could start it at the beginning of time, but we're going to start it here in the 1970s. Denver metro area is well past its heyday of streetcars that kind of built the city from the turn of the century up to about the post-war period of 1950 or so. In the 70s, cars had taken over. This is a shot of downtown Denver, and it's just like surface parking lots, which is sort of crazy. But this was happening all over America, right? The Eisenhower administration had just put a ton of money into building interstate highways across the country through cities like Denver, and this was one consequence of that. It became a lot easier to drive, so people drove more, and when you drive more, you need space for cars. So this is what downtown Denver looked like at the time. And people liked it. You could go more places than you could on a streetcar or a bus, but there were some consequences to this, right? Denver became known for its brown cloud in this era, in the 70s and 80s. So in the early 70s, the state legislature created a public transit service called the Regional Transportation District, or RTD. And right away, they were more than just buses. They wanted to build something big. They wanted to build a network of rapid transit so that the people of Denver and surrounding areas could move around quickly without a car. So in 1973, the vision was personal rapid transit, these little pods up here on this elevated track. And the idea was you would go to a station, get in a pod, punch in which station you wanted to go to, and then that pod would shuttle you around this entire network, maybe miles away, and bring you to the spot, and then the shuttle pod thing would go back into service. That was in 1973. It got as far as a test track out toward what is DIA right now, but never got built. The federal government pulled funding. They thought it was a little too out there to put a bunch of money into. The rail vision still had not been fulfilled by the late 70s. This is 1983. RTD is still talking about what sort of rapid transit system they can get voter buy-in for, and political support to really kind of turn these dreams into realities. By the early 90s, they got there. They built a thing. It was originally supposed to go from Stapleton Airport to downtown. Community pushback in the Park Hill area shortened that. But in 1994, RTD opened its first light rail line. This was right downtown. It went from 30th and Downing and 5 Points, snaked through downtown, and then kind of cut over toward I-25 and came down to I-25 and Broadway. It's still a very heavily used line in the system today. And it was a big deal, right? It was like, I pulled a couple videos from TV station basement archives, and like the mayor's out there, governor's out there, Roy Romer still looks very young and chipper, and like people went crazy for this thing. The trains were packed. This was a big deal. And so RTD sees this and they're like, okay, so they do like the trains. What can we do with this? And they start building a plan for an entire network of train lines all over the metro area. There was a failed attempt in the late 90s, but by the early 2000s, RTD had put together a plan and was taking it to the ballot. It was getting support from mayors all over the metro area. And then finally, it got the support of one very important mayor, the newly elected John Hickenlooper, mayor of Denver. Let's see.
If you vote yes on 4A and the Fast Tracks plan, it could change the way you start your day. It could change how you get to the airport and the game, and open a new door to the city. Fast Tracks will expand rapid transit throughout the entire metro area and suburbs. So why stay stuck in the past when you can move smoothly into the future? Fast Tracks. The time is now.
There were a bunch of ads like this, 3 or 4, and they had the establishment behind them. The Chamber of Commerce types were behind them, business interests. Every mayor in the region through the Metro Mayor's Caucus supported this. In fact, check me on that, but it had a lot of political support. The governor at the time did not, Bill Owens, he did not like this idea, and his DOT did not like this idea, but RTD had done so much groundwork building support for this at the local level that it didn't matter. They went to the ballot. RTD is its own political animal. They have autonomy, they have their own funding, revenue source, so they can kind of do what they want to some extent. Lynn might check me on that. So they're going around, they're getting support, and in the Northwest region, this is what that looked like. This is the Northwest Rail alignment, starting down at Union Station in Denver, hits Westminster, Church Ranch, Broomfield, Louisville, Boulder Junction, Gun Barrel, and Longmont. Of course, no surprises here, but that's not quite built yet. But right next to it, along US 36, you see sort of a grayed outline. That's the Flatiron Flyer. The Flatiron Flyer is the rapid bus line from Boulder to Denver, and that was part of Fast Tracks too. Fast Tracks was RTD told Boulder, we're going to give you both bus and rail here, and that always kind of caught my eye as I was doing some reporting on this, because Boulder was the only, in the US 36 corridor, were the only corridors in the metro that got both bus and rail projects in here, which turned out to be very important later. So someone in the Boulder region that I'm sure many of you know, Spence Havlick, was on Boulder City Council at the time. And so I sat down with Spence a couple of years ago and we talked through the history of all this. And I asked him, like, did you have any sense, back in 2002, 2003, as RTD is putting this together, that they were going to be able to do this? And he said, yeah, he heard some skepticism here and there, but RTD was respected. Cal Marcello was who was leading RTD at the time. He was a very good leader who had earned his trust. So he was persuaded. And Cal did that all over the metro area. So the ballot measure passes with I think 58% of the vote. They get national press. RTD was written up in the New York Times that year. This was the biggest transit expansion of the era. So very, very big deal. And then within a few years, the bottom kind of falls out of the project. There are cost overruns. The legislature leans on them and pulls RTD brass in front of committees and wants to know what is going on here. Because when you go to the public in this very public way and ask for money and promise specific things, people want to hear progress updates. They want to see studies being done, but also things being built. And so for a while here, from about 2007 to 2010 or 11, things were looking pretty dicey. In the Northwest region, there were questions as to whether it would ever be built because it was just the budget for that particular project, the Northwest Rail project, was getting out of hand. And we'll get into the details of that shortly. But RTD kind of turned it around. In about 2011, 2012, they hired a new general manager, Phil Washington, who has since gone on to Los Angeles Metro, DIA, and now the FAA, the federal level. So his star has certainly risen. But he was a executive at RTD through all this, and then was hired as the CEO in around 2010, 2011. And he really, as staff of the time told me, just reset the focus of the organization. The conversation turned from like, I don't know if we can do this, to how are we gonna do this? And just people really worked it. They got studies done, they got federal grants, really big federal grants that helped bring projects back from the dead that looked like they were not going to be built for years and years. They did innovative things with finances on the A line to the airport, the first little leg of the B line to Westminster, and the G line to Arvada and Wheat Ridge. He signed a public-private partnership with a for-profit company that fronted a lot of money to build those lines. That was not part of the original plan, but they were really pulling out the stops to find different ways to get these projects moving. And the excitement was palpable. This was around the time I moved to Denver. The first weekend I was in town was the weekend that Union Station opened. And I remember going down there and being like, well, this is cool. I wonder how long this has been here. And it had just opened. And it all just felt like it was working. There were people moving in and out of these stations in ways that, like Union Station went from being this kind of dead zone in downtown to the real focal point of central Denver. It was just like the place to be. So that was before a global pandemic and a few other problems that came along the way. And as part of this project, I pulled some data for ridership data for every train line that RTD built. The first one was the W line in 2013 as part of Fast Tracks, and then there have been about half a dozen since then. Because I wanted to know, was it worth it? And what this chart shows is on the far right here, you've got the original ridership estimates for 2025. This was straight out of RTD's 2004 Fast Tracks plan. This is what they showed to voters and said, if we build this, we think this many people are going to ride by 2025. So as you can see on these line charts, yes, there's that big dip for the pandemic there, but even before that, many of these lines, especially the W line and the R line, were really struggling to find the ridership that RTD had initially projected for them. And there's a couple different reasons for that. I won't get into them too much here, but I think the main one is just where RTD decided to put these rail lines. The W line, for instance, from downtown Denver west out to Golden, it does not follow the original streetcar line down West Colfax. It follows the Lakewood Gulch for much of that way, which is just a few blocks away, but it's not in the middle of things. It's sort of hard to get to if you're on foot. It does not go by very many businesses because the streetcar system for 70 years had concentrated all that development on Colfax itself. So there are different iterations of that all over the system, but that I think explains a lot of why some of these lines were underperforming. Looking forward, there is just a ton of growth happening in Denver and suburbs that got these rail lines. So this is in Rhino up by 38th and Blake. As more things like this start getting built, and as different municipalities sort of reform their land use policies to incentivize density and to reduce parking minimums and things like that, that is going to push more ridership to these lines. So while that chart is pretty rough for RTD right now, I do expect that these lines, if RTD can keep operating them, keep operating them at consistent service levels, then I think this is an investment that could pay off in the very long-term future. But there is the money side of this. RTD spent a lot of money to build these things. As of 2020, they had about $5 billion in debt service, so interest, and concessionaire payments, so the private company that operates the A line. All of that through 2050, for the next 30 years, RTD is going to be paying about $5 billion toward that. And that's really hampering what they can do on the rest of their system, because they are very overextended in paying for these train lines. So where does that leave RTD? This slide is straight from RTD. This went in front of the board over the summer, and it stuck out to me because it is very honest. And it just kind of sums up in one slide the situation that RTD is facing. They operated more service than they could afford. They deferred really important maintenance projects that they're trying to catch up on now. And over the long term, there's just really not a lot of money to expand service, to build new lines, to run buses more often in places like Boulder. And that kind of all adds up to this significant gap between what people want, what the people of Boulder want, what the people of Denver want, and what RTD can actually deliver. Hard truth, but there we are. There's a few other unanswered questions. There's a big Tabor vote coming in the next couple of years. I won't get into the intricacies of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, but if you haven't heard the Taxman podcast from CPR, we did a 3-part series kind of pulling that thing apart and where it came from and what it's done to state government. But basically, unless voters approve a ballot question in the next couple of years, RTD could be refunding a lot of money to voters in the future because of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And there's this open question out there right now about how much support there would be for increased funding for RTD, for a tax increase. And those conversations are just starting to happen right now. They may be happening behind closed doors for longer. They don't invite me to those meetings for some reason. But there's this open question about, should we ask? Who could we get on this campaign? So that is something I'm definitely keeping an eye on. So Boulder. We are in Boulder today. I drove here, unfortunately, because the bus doesn't run very often, and there is no train. But okay, so where are we at with the Boulder line? This photograph here, our photographer took a couple of years ago at Boulder Junction, and it just kind of tells you the state of Northwest Rail, which is there are buildings going up there, and there's a very brambly looking bush on the track itself where there should be service. So the current estimate is $1.5 billion. At current financial projection is maybe sometime around 2050, RTD might have enough money to start building it. And a lot has changed since these estimates came out. Pandemic did all sorts of weird things to RTD's budget. Right now they are working on a new study looking at just rush hour only service. So that might shift these numbers around a bit. We should get some details on that in the next year or so. So why wasn't it built? So the main obstacle here is space, frankly. This map from CDOT shows the location of every freight rail line in the Denver Metro. And if you follow the line from Denver all the way up 36 to Boulder and then up the diagonal toward Longmont, that is the line that RTD wanted to use for Northwest Rail. It's also owned by Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which is a very big company that doesn't like being told what to do. So they, there's a lot of history there, and many meetings were held to try to figure out if RTD could basically rent space on that track. And what it kind of boiled down to in the end was RTD wanted to run its trains so often up and down this rail line. I think it was every 15 or every 30 minutes all day long, that basically precluded BNSF from using that line for their own purposes. And so in 2011, I believe, BNSF said, okay, so if you want to do this, it's gonna, whoop. Did I hit something? Oh no. Okay. If you want to do this, it's going to cost you more than $500 million just to get the access rights to this track. That's like the rental fee. Not to own it, but just to like get access to it, so then RTD could start building their stations and all the infrastructure that they would need to actually operate service on here. That was way more money than RTD had expected. They had the number they had kind of pulled out of the air by just looking at similar systems across the country back in 2004 was like $66 million they thought they would have to spend just to get access rights here. So this really shocked them, and it pushed the project to the back burner for a long time because they had a lot of other things going on. They had to get the A line built, they had to get the R line, and all those other things down in the heart of the Denver Metro. So yeah, right now we have Boulder. The city built a station, built a new neighborhood essentially around the station, and it's pretty quiet. I spent some time up there reporting this story and talking to people who lived there, and one of whom moved there for the train and clearly is still waiting for it. So it's a transit station with very little transit. Some buses do go there, but it is not quite reached the vision that both Boulder had for it and RTD. But Boulder did get a bus, right? The Flatiron Flyer, we talked about that. Very popular, and it kind of covers a lot of the same ground, not identical clearly, because this rail line, it's been there for many years, and cities like Louisville were built around this rail line. So like in downtown Louisville, the city there has done a lot of work to kind of orient itself towards their train station, which of course still doesn't have a train. But this bus line is in existence, not the Flatiron Flyer 2, that's the Express that RTD had to cut back during the pandemic, but they do want to bring it back. So I wanted to know, like, why did the US 36 corridor in Boulder, how did they get these two parallel systems put into the Fast Tracks plan? And I found the retired engineer at RTD whose job it was to basically, build this plan and pencil it out and make sure that it was possible. And I asked him, like, how was it that both of these lines were in the Fast Tracks plan? And he said, well, it was a mistake. He did not like that there were two lines in here. He said they were competing because they're so similar geographically that if you have a bus line and then you open a train line and they kind of go to the same place, you might get some new riders, but also you're going to be just shifting people from a bus to a train. And what's happening there? Is that really worth the money? You're cannibalizing one system for the other, was his point. And I said, okay, well, why did that happen? And he said communities up there wanted to get as much as they possibly could, and they didn't get any pushback from RTD. Cal Marcelo let them get away with it. And those are tough words, but I think that does explain a lot of the situation that we have today, where Boulder just has this bus line, but also there's a lot of anger here, understandably so, because you were also promised a rail line. So, do we have to wait until 2050? I don't know. But there's good news. The state legislature in 2021 created a rail district that covers the entire Front Range, from Trinidad in the south on I-25 all the way up past Fort Collins. And this district has the potential to be like the second largest government in the state, behind the state of Colorado. They are the second largest if you just look at their district boundaries. And they're tasked with doing studies and working with Amtrak here, who has said they want to start passenger rail in Colorado. Doing studies and just kind of leading up to a starter service, a train line that would go from Fort Collins down to Pueblo to start out with. And depending on how all of that shakes out, they might just use the Northwest Rail Corridor. The sponsors of the legislation actually wrote in it that the alignment that hits Boulder and Longmont is the preferred alignment, which your friends in North Glen are not happy about, but there we are. So, this is a big if, but there is this statewide and even federal push to start a new rail service along the Front Range. And the idea is that if that happened here, maybe the state would pay the bill to BNSF to get access to that track, or at least help pay the bill, and then RTD wouldn't have to cough up all of that money, that they could share these costs. So that big if, but there is some movement there, and that is something I'm paying attention to a lot. A new tax would most likely be required to really make this a thing. The legislature gave them the ability to ask for up to a 0.08% 8-cent sales tax, and that would be double what RTD asked for with fast tracks and cover much more ground. So it would raise a lot more money, but clearly it would build a much bigger system. And the how fast tracks played out, there is certainly some unhappiness with how it played out, and so there's an open question out there about how much support there is going to be among voters to increase taxes to pay for a train line. So we'll see how that turns out. And I think that's all I have. Thank you all so much for having me, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Hi, I'm got the microphone, and unfortunately fortunately, our first question is online. So we're going to go to Merrill. Merrill?
There we go. Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks for speaking to the club. I'm a big fan of rail systems, and I even like taking our 80-year-old trains out to California. Just like the old movies, only they're more run down. But here's my question. A big part of the problem is people do not have a lot of incentive to get out of their cars. And even with traffic, they get folks to where they are going most effectively compared to other options. And even with gas prices having gone up, and most people are not motivated to change, even with the traffic that we're experiencing. And many of the most serious costs of cars, and here's the critical issue, pollution and climate change are externalized or socialized. So here's the first question that needs to be asked as we want to ask the taxpayers for additional funds. Even with a rail line, how do you get large numbers of people out of their cars?
If you're asking me, I'm afraid I don't have a good answer.
Either do I.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, and you kind of see this in different cities across the country, but it's almost a trade-off between pain during construction. If you put a rail line where people are, construction can be just horrible, like really disruptive. You're going to put businesses under. But at the end of it, you have a train where ideally there is still activity and business in homes. That's one way of doing it. Or as RTD did it, you put rail in places where it's less disruptive to build. So think of like, you know, the lines in Denver that don't go straight down Broadway, for example. They go over along the Santa Fe corridor and the old freight corridor, where there was more space available. And now there's apartment buildings sprouting up around there, around like Alameda Boulevard. And all that development is helping for sure. And more people that are now moving into those new apartments, I would assume, are also riding these trains because they're right there. But that line's been open for 25 years, at least. And you know, it takes that long for the development to catch up with the rail. So I guess to answer your question, like, you know, it's a combination of putting rail in useful places, and also like pushing cities and people that control land use and developers to build in a way that supports all this very expensive rail infrastructure.
Hi, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to sneak in two questions. When do you expect RTD to have their first electric vehicle fleet? And autonomous vehicles, do you have any studies, calculations on the throughput versus a rail system when you're going to have autonomous driving buses?
Sure. RTD had their first electric vehicle, I think, 7-8 years ago. The 16th Street Mall shuttle in downtown Denver has been all electric for quite a while. They are also got a federal grant in the last couple of years to add more electric buses, so they're working on that. There's big challenges with infrastructure. You have to basically rebuild your maintenance facilities to have chargers and all the supporting infrastructure you need to really make it work. And they're more expensive off the bat. You do save some of that with maintenance costs. But they have a board committee right now that is kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of what the strategy is that they're working toward here. So I expect to hear some more on that in the next couple of months, I think. As far as autonomous vehicles, you know, autonomous vehicles, like I'm a little skeptical. You know, I was walking around San Francisco last summer and I saw them everywhere. And so on the one hand, you think like, oh my God, they're going to be here any week. Wow. And the promise, of course, is like you don't need to pay for someone to drive them if you're RTD. And you can fit more of them on one piece of roadway because you take the human element out of it. But you know, from the reading I've done on the autonomous side, it seems like things kind of hit a crescendo in terms of excitement and venture capital funding about 5 years ago. And now that industry is sort of taking a step back and reckoning with the fact that they're not meeting a lot of their goals in terms of when they're going to get these on the street. So it's, you know, I'm sure they're going to come at some point, but I think if you're an RTD and if you are tasked with moving people today, like you can't, you know, you've got to both worry about those near-term must-dos and this long-term thing that might come sometime, but anyone's guess is good on when that'll be.
Great. We have one more question.
Once again, thank you. A few years back, I was on an expedition, one of several, in the jungles of part of New Guinea. And one of the people I was with was the transportation director, as I understood, in California. And we talked about these issues some, and traffic was already a serious problem, along with pollution. He indicated to me that part of the problem was that the data showed that trains did not really decrease the density of car travel. and that it was frustrating to them at the time, and I presume still is. I don't have an answer, but I go back now a few years. I would expect that the data continues. The people want it, but do we understand what the data shows to help us get out of our cars?
Yeah, I think this kind of gets back to what I was saying about that chart that showed kind of disappointing ridership. You know, that system as it existed in, say, 2016 or 17, that was mostly overlaid on a city that had been built for the car for the last 70 years. And like I said, I think that those ridership numbers, there's a million variables, but as more development happens, that is not for the car, but is for transit, so taller buildings, fewer parking spots, that'll change. And I think that's really the long-term answer here, is you can't just build a new train line and then go, why isn't anyone using this thing? Because you have to, like, there's the train line and then there's the city around it. And the two things just kind of move at different speeds. Like, trains take a long time to build, but building a city takes even longer.
I think we're out of time. Nathaniel, thank you so much for your great reporting, and thank you in particular for the excellent 4-part podcast, The Ghost Train, that we can all find on the CPR website. Still, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but for the last 35 years, Rotary International has been involved in the fight to eradicate polio. And in that time, great strides have been made. And we're ever so close to doing it, but we're not quite there. As an expression of our gratitude to you for appearing today, we're going to donate 100 doses of polio vaccine in your name. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all.